All right, so a little bit about us at ClearMeasure. We are a Texas headquartered software architecture company that is empowering software delivery, and really we're enabling in-house .NET teams to be self-sufficient so that they can move fast, deliver quality, and run their systems with confidence. Of all the different people that offer just general professional services, consulting, that type of thing, a lot of companies want to build the software for their client, but our clients have developers in-house. Our clients want to build the software and have a top-notch software capability in-house. And so that's why they come to us. We're a software architecture company. We're not trying to be a dev shop outsourcer competing with the in-house development teams. Our goal is for the in-house team to be up-leveled, to increase in skill and capability. And so that's our focus, and we love doing that because we celebrate when our clients' teams are able to do more types of software and have some really big wins. Before we go into the content, there is some things that we like to offer on these webinars. And if this is your first webinar with ClearMeasure, welcome. We're so happy to have you. And every month, and sometimes we throw in more than one per month, but every month we have a webinar on a timely topic where we dive in and present some really important information, but also answer questions. And so we always like to have a free offer. The current one is a free electronic copy of my latest book, .NET DevOps for Azure. And of course, you can get print books. You can order that anywhere books are sold. But if you'd like an electronic copy for yourself, just send me an email. I'd be happy to provide that to you. And of course, during the webinar, you can put that in the chat. And if you forwarded the recording of this webinar to one of your team members, then we'll honor that offer as well for them. If you are not currently already a listener to my podcast, I'd love to have you in the listenership, the Azure DevOps podcast. We focus on topics related to any kind of software in the Microsoft ecosystem. And so we've had Philip Christian is going to come out recently. We've had Udi Dahan from In-Service Bus with durable messaging. We've had so many interesting guests. Uncle Bob Martin has been on the show, and we love that weekly interview podcast. Also, we have some videos on architecttips.clearmeasure.com you might be interested in. Okay, we like to relate everything back to your overall process for developing software. So we're going to be talking about .NET 6 today. And the good news, first and foremost, for .NET 6 is that it does not change the way, if you've done a complete implementation of a DevOps environment in your team, then .NET 6 does not change the state of the art with the way that you do that. So that's good news. Just want to say that up front. And actually, as we'll see as we go through the content, more and more application types in .NET 6 can have a consistent DevOps process than what was previously possible because of the unification of some of the technologies. But what you're looking at here, I know there's a lot of text on the screen. We've done entire webinars just digging in on every detail of what you need to have in a DevOps environment. We're not going to do that here. We don't have the time. But this is just the top 1/3 of our architectural poster, our DevOps architectural poster. This is the full thing, but it's meant to be printed on 2-foot by 3-foot paper at a print shop. If you'd like the high resolution copy of this entire architecture poster, then just send me an email for that as well, or look for it in the chat. And the one thing I will say, because we see a lot of our clients not quite implementing this step, and this goes really any previous version of .NET as well, a lot of adoption with continuous integration. But what we find is that only 1 or 2 of the 3 continuous integration steps are widely implemented. And the 3 steps for continuous integration, this was all the way back to the 2006 book, literally called Continuous Integration, is the first step is a private build that runs on the engineer's workstation alone, no network access, just private build. The next step is the integration build, which runs on a team shared environment. And pretty much all the teams have some type of integration build, even if it's just very, very small and simple and inefficient. But and then the third step is the first deployment and startup of the new build of the application. We find that that third step is often ignored the most. And then the second most ignored step is having a private build script that every developer runs so that they know it's time to check in. But if you don't have all three steps of continuous integration implemented in your environment, then I'd encourage you to do that. And sometimes it's just a knowledge gap where having never read the canonical continuous integration book, they implement a CI server product, which really only gives them the integration build step. And then they say, oh, we've implemented continuous integration, but they've only implemented one of the three steps. So just wanted to put that out there. Okay. I am going to talk about all of the .NET 6 announcements that came out. Of course, most of them were announced at the .NET Conf event in late fall 2021. And if you want to go deep into all the individual technologies and presentations, those recordings are available on this URL, youtube.com/c/.net/videos. Okay. So let's get into it, and let's get into the interpretation of all of the announcements that Microsoft made around .NET 6. So big ones are, it's cross-platform and open source. Microsoft's goal was to unify the development platform for building anything. There's been so many different and disparate ways for building specifically IoT, AI, gaming, mobile with Xamarin. They integrated a few years ago, cloud and web. And of course, with .NET Core, initially desktop was left behind. And then with .NET 5, they kind of brought it into the fold, and .NET 6 really puts a polish on that. But the goal, the overall vision is with Visual Studio and C#, you can build all kinds of applications. Now, for .NET 6, and you see Visual Studio Code on here. For .NET 6, you'll want to use Visual Studio 2022. You'll want to use the full thing. And of course, I'd recommend that you have Enterprise, you have a Visual Studio subscription. That is going to get you the biggest bang for the buck. And for professional developers, I mean, there is a Visual Studio professional license, but you really want to be on the Enterprise, or the Visual Studio subscription gives you the Enterprise, but it also gives you your $150 of Azure credits every month, just for experimental environments. And so that's the best one. VS Code is growing in popularity, but mostly with other languages than C#, and is pulling in those programmers into the Microsoft ecosystem, and is very successful at that. VS Code is the most popular text editor among all kinds of non-C# programmers. So it's been a very, very successful product. But if you are a .NET team in your company, then the full Visual Studio 2022 has the support that you need. The experience for C# and .NET in VS Code, it's actually still lacking, still has a big gap between it and full Visual Studio. So you'll also want to add in ReSharper as well for your code navigation and your coding forward experience. But this is the vision. This is the big win with .NET 6, is bringing all these different application types into one set of libraries and APIs, and be able to do that all within Visual Studio. Okay. There are some accomplishments that have been highlighted, and this has to do with the growth of the platform. There are over 5.4 million active monthly users in the Visual Studio family of tools, and .NET Core and .NET 5, to put them together, has ranked #1 now 3 years in a row as the most loved framework on the Stack Overflow developer survey. And for .NET 6, there's been a lot of open source contributions, because of course there's been more and more, and almost all of it is open source at this point, where if you find a bug, you can contribute to it. Also, the performance of .NET 6 is one of the biggest wins. And I'm highlighting these things because as an architect, and I know that just based on looking at the registration list for this webinar, we have quite a few managers as well, people who are managing development teams. And you have to know that the platform that you're invested in with people and the tools and all that has runway, is not a platform that's kind of stagnant, going by the wayside. And so the .NET platform is on the move. It's growing. It's not only improving and getting faster, but it is gaining market share and growth in the market. So it's actually a really good investment. And obviously the whole industry is so large and so vast that from a literal perspective, and I get asked this question, people going to school for computer science and wanting to be programmers for their career, and maybe in high school they were taught some Java, or JavaScript, or Python, or maybe, some are more and more high schools are adopting C#, but they get asked, hey, what should I focus on? And they need to hear, and everybody needs to hear, the industry is so large that if a student decides to go deep in Python, guess what? They're going to be able to find work. If they decide to go deep in JavaScript, Java, they're going to be able to find work. And of course, same has always been true with C# and .NET. But for those of us who have and are continuing to build careers on the .NET platform and the Microsoft ecosystem, it is a really, really good time to be on this platform. It's growing, it's expanding, and it's topping the charts in so many different ways. The performance of .NET 6 is really top notch. The only frameworks, and really all these benchmarks are web benchmarks, but the only frameworks and platforms that outdo .NET 6 are ones that you've never heard of and people really are not using for mainstream development anyway. It's faster than Java, it's faster than Node, it's faster than Python, it's faster than PHP. So, I mean, we're at the top right now, we're at the top. Also, Entity Framework as a library, which really is the object relational mapper, it's improved a whole lot over .NET 6. So the query performance is good. As it comes to database access, going back to, I think, 2003, I used the in Hibernate open source object relational mapper for a long time. I was actually a slow adopter to adopt Entity Framework, and I actually didn't really endorse Entity Framework for widespread development until the version that came out with .NET Core. And now it's just a no-brainer. It is very, very good, very, very fast. Okay. Okay. And by the way, I think some questions have trickled in. I'll try to answer those at the right spot, but I promise at the end of the webinar, we won't close out until all the questions have been answered. Okay. All right. And I think we'll tackle this one. What specifically, here's a question. What specifically does a team gain from Visual Studio Enterprise over Visual Studio Professional? Looking at the Microsoft website on that, it doesn't seem that much of a gain. And I will say, if you look specifically at what you get and what you don't get, and the things that you do get you don't care about, then that's great. Don't pay for what you don't care about. We are a software architecture company, so for us, we go to so many different clients, and of course have to audit and inspect and evaluate code bases, and so we do need all the tools and capabilities. And so we've gotten the top SKU with the Visual Studio subscription. The subscription does include Azure credits, but if one of the lower SKUs that are a little bit more affordable does the job for you, I'm not going to oversell you. So go for it. Yeah. Good question. Good question. And another question just came in. You mentioned ReSharper earlier. Is it really that big of a game changer? My answer is yes. Now, as with any tool, you have to learn it. And every new version of Visual Studio that comes out, there's new refactorings and new shortcut keys and all this stuff. And probably one of my new segments, I should probably do a resharper demo in Visual Studio, and just to show how quickly one can move around the code and code forward, inspect the code, and really have a zero mouse Visual Studio editing experience. Because until you've learned it and experienced it firsthand, it's kind of hard to see. But I've been recommending that for years, and they are still investing very, very heavily in ReSharper, and so it's just as strong. It's got, of course, they're keeping up with Visual Studio 2022. All right, so let's keep going on with .NET 6 and what has been released. There is a continued focus on C#. So Visual Basic, there is continued talk over how Visual Basic is going to be supported, but it's pretty clear, C# is the way of the future, and Visual Basic is really in a, hey, we'll do our best to support it, but there's always going to be the gaps. .NET 6 is a long-term release. Microsoft has gone to now with .NET 5 and 6, they've said, we're going to keep on annual releases so everyone can plan. So I expect that this fall, there's going to be .NET 7, which will be a short-term release, and then the fall after will be .NET 8, which will be another long-term release, and that's how they'll go. All right, now for Visual Studio 2022, I think I've already covered everything in here, but that is the IDE that I do recommend that you be on for .NET 6. If you have significant development in TypeScript or Python or Ruby, then VS Code has tremendous support for those. But if your world is living in .NET 6, then you definitely need to be in the full Visual Studio. If you have older applications, there is a .NET Upgrade Assistant. It is out there. And so give it a shot. Now, as with every Upgrade Assistant, it's not going to cover every case. However, it is going to cover the cases where it's kind of easy and predictive, but because you have so many classes or so many elements of code in that way, you would be sitting there copying, pasting, making little tweaks and trying to do find and replace and changing config files and all kinds of stuff. And so the .NET Upgrade Assistant can help you with just the rote changes. But anything tricky that's specific to your architecture, just expect that you're going to have to change it by hand. I just want to be truthful with you that these upgrade assistants are great for the common cases that Microsoft knows about, but anything specific to your architecture, I try to be realistic. You're going to have to change it yourself. But it is good that they put these tools out there. As of last fall, there was already 40,000 downloads of the upgrade assistant, so people are using it, and so if you have some older .NET applications, then give it a shot and see if you can get it working on .NET 6 or see what the level of effort would be. Okay, one of the goals of .NET 6 and somewhat in .NET 5, but they continue to push it forward, was simplified development. And so here's some examples now where they've really simplified the development model. So the templates where you can say file new project inside Visual Studio, they've added more of the templates, and I think they have all the common ones available in the command line interface, where you can type the name of the template and scaffold it out at command line. And also they've enabled hot reload, which we'll talk about in a minute, on the command line, which means that you can run a job maybe that doesn't have a user interface, or even if it does, you can run it command line and say .NET watch run and enable it with hot reload while you're changing the code. And every time you change the code, it'll immediately change it. You don't have to stop and restart the application. And also .NET 6 is the first release that natively supports Apple Silicon ARM64 machines, and quite a few developers, especially those that have done iPhone applications for years, like to use like to use Mac, and so Apple Silicon, it does support that, or for desktop applications that just run on Windows ARM64 as well as Apple Silicon. And there is another one that I'll highlight, which is the last one, save the best for last on this slide, and that's the single file EXEs. Okay, we're talking about architectural implementations, thing that you should really take notice on. There's some of these announcements where it's an improvement and we like it and we'll use it. This one's huge. This one is huge. Single file EXEs for all platforms. It has been 20 years since Microsoft platform development teams have been able to distribute a single EXE for a program that does things. We're talking about in the 90s with the Visual C++ and Visual Basic platforms that compiled into a single EXE, and then all you had to have was that executable to run your program. Starting with .NET 1, you had an entire directory where you had the application, you had the EXE, but then you had all of the assemblies, all of the DLLs and everything in an entire directory, and you had to zip that up and ship it over. With .NET 5, there were self-extracting EXEs, so don't get this confused. There were self-extracting EXEs, so you could distribute a program as an EXE with .NET 5, but when that EXE was not your program, that EXE was some Microsoft wrapper. When you executed it behind the scenes, it acted like a zip file. It exploded your directory of files, which was your EXE and all the assemblies, into some other temporary directory that you did not choose, and then it ran your program from that other directory that you did not choose, and that was completely disconnected from your top level directory, which probably had your configuration files or access to your data files. So the .NET app domain is running with a working directory in some Windows directory that you did not choose because it was extracted as step one. .NET 6 fixes that. And now you can write Windows applications, you can write command line applications, you can write system tray, WPF applications, and you can distribute those however you like to as a single EXE, and they will run from that directory. And so it is fully seamless now. You can have your configuration files right next, app settings.json, or you can have those configuration files right next to the EXE, and you know where it's running from. The app domain runs from the directory that it's being run from. And so for people who are writing applications that run natively on the desktop, and that is huge. That is huge. Okay. I just looked at the Q&A window. No questions in the Q&A window just yet, so move on. Okay, hot reload. This is being talked about a lot. Chances are you've probably already seen a demo. Not going to dwell on it, but hot reload is very, very useful. There are a few quirks, and so my guess is that at the Microsoft Build Conference and with the run up to .NET 7, we're going to hear about some additional enhancements to .NET Reload. Now, if you're spending a lot of time making a change, refreshing a browser, making a change, refreshing a browser, that workflow is smooth and sweet in a lot of cases, and that saves you a lot of time, because just restarting the application, I mean, if you just count up the number of seconds, I don't have to sell you on the usefulness of this, but Microsoft is really trying to reduce the inner developer loop. And as someone who is guiding a team of .NET developers, you are concerned about the developer loop. I would advocate, when you think from an architectural perspective and a team design perspective, the developer loop right there on the workstation, that's great. Think of all the other developer loops. Think about the loop of a developer going for the next task and then doing the smaller loops and coming back with a pull request. Think about the team loop of integrating multiple pull requests into a new release candidate version, pushing out a new build. So from a thought process, it is absolutely necessary to think about the developer loop and identify all of them and make sure that your team is optimized on all of them. And this certainly helps with the single developer, the inner loop. All right. Question that came in: are there any exceptions to single file exes or a certain type of reference DLL that doesn't allow it? So the .NET 6 DLLs, .NET Standard, those are all supported. I imagine that there probably are some exceptions, given this is the first version of it. I haven't tested COM+ DLLs or assemblies where you're going to p invoke into it. I just haven't done that testing, so I don't know. You would have to go and test those out. But if 100% of your application is all .NET 6 compatible or .NET Standard, it works great. We've got some cases proving that out. Okay, let's keep going. All right. So in the frame of simplifying the code with C#10, the file new project templates in Visual Studio have been modified, but probably not modified as much as C#10 actually supports. These are huge from a lines of code perspective. Let me talk about the global usings first. And again, these are not developer level demos that we're doing here. And if you have not heard about anything, just search for online videos for global usings, and you'll find tons of demos, and they're super easy to just test for yourself. It used to be that it has been up to this point, every single one of your code files, you have the same number of using statements at the top: using system dot collections, using blah blah blah, and it was just like you had 8 lines of code at the top before you even got to a namespace. Well, most of those now, if you know that you're going to be using if you're using a the Notatime library for dates and times instead of the built-ins, which a lot of people do in order to get time zone support that's top notch, then you just do global using Notatime, and then you can use it in any code files without having to declare it. So that's huge. That will save you so many lines of code and just visual clutter in absolute every code file you open up. So make sure that your team uses it. You could have one of your developers just go through the code base for an hour one morning and just look at the code files that literally have the same ones, and just promote some of them to global using, and then clean up the rest of the code base. Again, this is a situation where resharper reformatting would just comb through and inspect using statements that are no longer necessary across the entire solution and just fix it for you. All right, the next is the file scope namespaces, so you don't have to indent. This saves you the curly brace at the top, the curly brace at the bottom. Not as huge of a gain, but is still worth doing, and definitely moving forward, you should use those. And so you can put the namespace at the top. C#10 does support just leaving out the namespace and basically inferring the namespace from the directory structure of your code. But you quickly run into a brick wall. You quickly get to a point where the namespaces of what the runtime is kind of guessing and assigning to your code, you want a little bit of control over it. So to dispense with namespaces in the first place, you need to make sure that you're within a scope that's going to be a very, very small program. And of course, we all have programs where there's a batch job, a really small batch job that needs to do something or listen to a single queue when messages come through, do something, call a web service, write record to a database. And it's the tiniest of tiny microservices. And in those cases, implicit namespaces where you don't even declare it, could that be useful? Sure, and you'd be fine. But in our experience, in most cases, We still need to use the namespaces, but file scope namespaces work great, especially when there's very, very few using statements at the top. The namespace line is pretty close to the top. Records, records being used as structs as well as classes is the next one. .NET 5 came out with support for records. We still haven't seen a lot of widespread guidance in the industry with regarding records. At ClearMeasure, we've adopted them pretty rigorously where we can. We have not found any places where we fell off a cliff and were surprised and had to undo the change. But when it comes to our entities, when it comes to classes that are persisted with Entity Framework to a SQL Server database, it appears that records is a great simplification. And I encourage, if you're not familiar with these, I encourage you to develop some records and then compile it and then decompile the code with .NET Reflector or the built-in Resharper support. Decompile the code so that you can see the actual class that a record class compiles into, because a record is a record class or a record struct. There's no new thing in the .NET runtime called just record. Record is a modifier of a class or a modifier of struct. And ultimately, the object that's in memory that's running when your program is running is either a class or a struct. But if you put the record keyword on there, then the compiler is going to automatically compile get hash code. It's going to automatically compile an equals method for you. It's automatically going to compile a toString method. It's going to automatically compile implicit operators and some explicit operators and conversion and casting operators, where for people who've made the most of the type system with regular entities, you've had to create those by hand. So test those out. Those are, I recommend that you adopt records. And then lambdas have types. That's a neat improvement. If you need it, but it's not going to be a major change for everyone's code base. Okay, also minimal APIs. Microsoft is couching these for cloud native apps. I would say for any application where you just need a super simple web service. For example, let's say you're using a WPF application for a system tray application. Say you're doing a competitor to OneDrive or Dropbox or Google Drive or something that runs as an icon in the system tray, and it's just doing a little something. But you want to be able to have a pop-up application that has a few screens that does something or provides some sort of integration with a companion application that you already have. Your system tray app, which essentially is an unattended application, can expose a local web service that other applications running on the same computer can call over to. And now you have inter-process communication just by this. Any application can do it. Now, don't go crazy. This is not a replacement for Web API. If you're going to create a Swagger-based Web API, especially if it's going to be a public API where you need good documentation and versionable URLs so that you can deprecate certain web APIs and bring up new versions of others, you're not going to use this. This is only for the simplest one-off cases, especially when you think, where does this go? This goes in your program.cs or your startup class. You're not going to want to have web service code mixed in there. Program and startup is just your bootstrapping code, is just to get started. And you see here, app.map get hello world. Well, guess what? We have one line of application logic. The classes, the startup classes, that should only be bootstrap code. So you do not want to don't want to slide into creating application code and business logic in those classes. Hard to maintain, quickly get out of control. But when you need a tiny minimal API, there it is. Okay, let's move to the cloud development announcements. The big focus again with .NET 6 is be able to build anything on the platform, no matter what type of app you're building. .NET, with .NET you can build it, and with Azure you can run it. That's the big message, and it is true. Let's talk about the two different types of applications that Azure is really trying to support. The common pattern that's been around for decades is in-tier applications, where you have some user interface portion that then calls to some other process that's running somewhere else. On the web front, it's a web application, maybe a SPA application that's in a browser, calling over to a server with some web services that then calls over to a database, or a Windows application or a mobile application running on a device that calls via some protocol over to a server, which then calls over to a SQL Server database. And so those have been around for a long time. And we're going to skip the middle ground and go to the pendulum swing, go to the abused microservices. There's a lot of people that have adopted microservices because they've witnessed in-tier applications get really, really large and unwieldy, and they look at it and say, man, this really should be 5 different applications, and we've crammed it all up into one. So if we make a change in one, we have to deploy all of it, and it gets hard to work with. And then with microservices, and there's been a pendulum swing to the other side, where now we're starting to see stories and case studies where companies create literally hundreds of little programs running around, and they're all trying to coordinate with each other. And whereas the in-tier application that was too big, might have had 1,000 entities and 2,000 classes with business logic that did stuff. Now it's almost like you have 3 or 4 classes per microservice in the cases gone wrong. So the answer is always somewhere in the middle, right? Neither extreme. Everything in moderation. Wow, that tends to be true. So if you have an in-tier application that's too large, that has multiple applications trying to get out, well, then absolutely segment it, and segment it down to the part that makes sense for your scenario. And so when you think of microservices, think of the tenets of microservices, not the word micro, which can be misleading, because there's no goal to make an application micro. The goal is to make an application do one thing, and whatever size that happens to end up is okay. But when you do it, it needs to be autonomous. So if you have a Git repository with one of these microservices or one of these smaller applications, it needs to have the user interface components to be able to function. It needs to have the entities and business logic for it to be able to function. And it needs to own the database in order to function. And then, of course, just like any other application, it needs to depend on and be able to call over to other applications that in order to ask it questions or push events, things like that. So coordination. All right. So I just want to quick aside on those, but .NET and Azure supports all of them pretty well. And so the focus on the Azure front is Azure App Service. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Azure Static Web Apps, but Azure Functions is the next one. So Azure App Service is the gorilla in the Azure cloud. You can host everything in there, and it has enough flavors to support. You can have services that just run headless, kind of behind the scenes, listening to queues, or maybe all they are is some web services, and that's fine. You have full-on web applications where 100% of the user interface is there. You've got all kinds of stuff in Azure App Service, and it works everywhere, Windows and Linux. If you're on .NET Core, .NET 5, .NET 6, then and your application doesn't have any legacy components, well, then it doesn't matter if you're on Windows or Linux, because your app can run equally good in both. Let me jump to Azure Functions. Azure Functions is when you need to be serverless. You absolutely need to be serverless, whether it's you need seamless scale up, or whether you need to be able to go, a few hours with nothing running and have no costs to you. But when something happens, you need to swarm it and have high compute. So your scale going up and down, up and down, up and down. If you just have a batch job, which is kind of plodding along and processing things, Azure Functions is going to be a distraction for you because it's not meant to run that way. You're better off running it as an Azure app service using one of those service workers. Also, if you need something, if you need high response time, Azure App Service and a worker service is going to give you better response time, because if you're not doing anything, it takes a while for the first instance of your Azure function to start up after you have an event come through. And then with Azure Static Web Apps, that's where you can use blob services to have an HTML website or a Blazor WebAssembly application. That's there. And if the pricing or scale model fits, then that's great, use it. But we still find Azure App Service to be the most flexible for .NET teams. And I think we had a comment. A question: is durable functions supported in runtime 4.0? That is a very specific versioning question. I don't know the answer to that, so I'll have to defer. That's not part of the what I either remember or included here. So sorry, I couldn't answer that right off the cuff. All right, let's expand from Azure App Service to something that is really exciting from an Azure perspective: Azure Container Apps. It is preview now, but we've tried it out. And even in preview status, it works. And I think that this is real time. Or I think that this is going to be real. I'm really hopeful that at the Microsoft Build Conference, they put this in general availability, or at least some type of commitment, because under the covers, Azure Container Apps runs your application in a Kubernetes pod. Okay, so your app is on Kubernetes, but Microsoft it's always been really great at adding tooling. Basically wraps it in a control panel and command line interface that looks really similar to Azure App Service. And so you can deploy it and you can scale it and you can service it just like you're used to with Azure App Service. And it's really simplified, but under the covers, it is running in Kubernetes. So it's a great place to start out. And then over time, if for some reason you really have the characteristics where you need to be able to control native Kubernetes, then you can upgrade to Azure Kubernetes Service, and your applications, well, they've been running in Kubernetes from the get-go. I think this is the future of Azure, where we love the tooling, we love the model, but Kubernetes is complicated with a capital comp. And we have gone deep in Kubernetes. We have many clients implemented. We have a massive Kubernetes implementation for a client that we took from .NET full framework on virtual machines all the way to completely cloud native inside Kubernetes with all the different service management. It is not simple. And your regular .NET developers, it's not something that you just do on the side. You have to intentionally have a reason for doing it, because it doesn't just fall into place. So I think that Azure Container Apps wrapping the power of Kubernetes, but simplifying away the complexity, that's a winning situation. Absolutely. Because developers want to be able to focus on building apps instead of managing infrastructure. All right, let's close out with modern client development and the announcements there. We've done quite a few webinars on Blazor, and it is one of the exciting new frameworks that runs on top of .NET 6. I do believe that Blazor and all the different flavors is going to be the new, quote, new normal .NET application. As we go forward and we say, oh, I'm building a web app on .NET, people will just assume that it's a Blazor app. When you're augmenting, modernizing, or building a WPF app, over time, WPF will be the shell and the nativeness, but the screens will be Blazor screens. Same with WinForms, same with the system tray applications, and same with mobile, which I'll talk about in a second. but we're not going to go deep into Blazor. There's plenty of other content we've put out. If you're not familiar with Blazor, just join our community. I believe the URLs are in the chat. We have webinar archives. We have plenty on Blazor that you can get access to. But Blazor is huge from an architectural perspective. This should completely shift what your .NET team is doing, because chances are your longtime .NET developers understand HTML and CSS. All of your web application developers understand all those, and they just drop into Blazor, and this becomes what I would predict becomes the common write once, run everywhere framework for user interfaces. Now, Blazor, again, it's just a user interface framework. It sits on top of C#, on top of .NET. For saving data to relational databases, you got Entity Framework. For programs talking to each other, you still got Web API. This is just a user interface framework. Whereas what are the other choices? The other choices are MVC, React, Angular, WinForms, WPF, and this allows all of your code. Well, some of your code will be HTML, some of it CSS, but all the rest of the code is C#. And so this competes directly and gives us an alternative to Angular and React and Vue, where all of the user interface code had to be TypeScript. So that's huge. This definitely, if you are not already strategizing adoption of Blazor, I recommend that you do so. Okay. .NET 6 actually had some enhancements over .NET 5. They just kind of play into it, make it faster, things like that. But it's really just about .NET 6 providing the canonical version 3 of Blazor. And so, you know, we jumped on Blazor when it was still in .NET Core, and there were definitely bleeding edge elements, but then you had the enhancements for .NET 5, and then .NET 6 gives you the full version 3 of Blazor, and it really is compelling at this point. When we started, when it was still .NET Core, there were not a whole lot of UI components like there are now. Microsoft's Fluent UI components are available for Blazor natively through the Blazor Fluent UI wrapper. You can find that in NuGet, and you can go on Microsoft's website to see demos of all the controls available, as well as Radson controls and Infragistics and all the commercial controls. The control vendors and component, they've really caught up and have a lot of first-class UI components for Blazor. So it's a really good ecosystem. Okay, now let's talk about MAUI. Let's conclude on that, because I really hope that is also going to be announced at the Microsoft Build Conference. .NET MAUI stands for multi-platform application user interface. And it is the evolution of Xamarin Forms. So if you do have some applications that use Xamarin Forms, it'll be just a really easy upgrade. If you didn't use Xamarin Forms and were using Xamarin, then you're going to have to change some things. But it really is to enable cross-platform desktop and mobile apps from a single code base, not just mobile, desktop. Think about it. Windows, Mac, iPad, iPhone, Android tablet, Android phone, single Visual Studio project. And of course, you're going to have some .NET Standard libraries in your Visual Studio solution. One Visual Studio solution, one UI project, all of these targets. When I was first getting into development in the mid-90s, Sun Microsystems, which was later acquired by Oracle, had the vision with Java to be write once, run anywhere. Well, it was write once, run in a lot of places, but it didn't run well in a lot of places. MAUI looks like it is running well in a lot of places, and most of the places that we care about. One single code base, one single development team. You write your application, and you can deploy it to all these different. This is huge. All right, now I'm going to blow your mind a little bit more with the next one, and that is Blazor can kind of be the user interface framework in all these different types of applications. So now if your team is already really great at HTML and CSS, and you're thinking, oh shoot, I need to make them Xamarin developers to be able to do all this stuff, or your application can be HTML and CSS, use all the Blazor controls, and yet run natively and be deployed to all of these places. So when I say one application type, think Blazor and MAUI, and you can write one code base, but it can be so many different types of places. This, my friends, is absolutely huge, absolutely huge. So look for the Microsoft Build Conference. Make sure to jump on all the demos, try this out for your teams, for your application types. And this is absolutely huge. You can start using the MAUI preview right now in Visual Studio 2022 Preview Edition. I think include the URL visualstudio.com/preview. So you can use the latest release of MAUI right now, which for the Android emulator, I know is pretty darn stable. They're still working on a few bugs, just getting the iOS emulator to launch properly. And from the last I heard, because of Apple's restrictions, you will still have to have some type of Mac computer somewhere reachable on your network or hosted somewhere in the cloud, because the compilation step for code that runs on iOS has to be done on an Apple computer. Apple has not opened up its ecosystem like Microsoft has. And so Microsoft is working on simplifying the tooling and the workflow to comply with the legal requirements of Apple's user terms, while at the same time making it workable. But .NET MAUI, look for it. It's not out just yet. It was announced to be released this year, so that's huge. Okay. I think one of the questions, will there be a MAUI template that is Windows only? I don't know. Given the vision, I would not expect it to be, because its goal is to be multi-targeted. So I would expect the template to include Windows, and then you just build it for Windows, and you just happen to not deploy it anywhere but Windows. So I think that probably does it. All right, so here's all the relevant URLs for what was announced in .NET 6. And there were lots of URLs that were shared in the chat for the my latest book, the DevOps poster. And let's see if I missed any questions. Question about Azure Container Apps. Can you have multiple namespaces just like you'd have in your own AKS cluster? I can't answer that right now. We have piloted it to see how close they were to actually having it come out, and we determined that they were serious about this. They were really working on it hard, but it is still in preview status. We have not tested the namespaces aspect or integrated Kubernetes metrics. So it's a preview service, so you have to look at that, but let me know what you find out if you do run that through its paces. And another, does app service cost anything when it is shut down? The answer is no. If you absolutely turn it off, sorry, the answer is yes. The app service doesn't cost anything, but your storage service is going to charge you a few pennies per month to just maintain whatever you have deployed. But storage has always been really cheap. Whereas with app service, you have to pay for the running instance of the server size that you have selected. With Azure Container Apps, it is 100% serverless. So you don't choose a server size. You say, based on the load, I want you to run between this many cores, low and high, and this much memory, low and high. And it just kind of scales and stays within your budget constraints. Okay. I believe we answered all the questions. We'll get you out about 2 minutes early. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. Again, ClearMeasure is a software architecture company. So if you are a member or run a .NET team in-house, we have very, very easy to engage advisory architecture retainers where we can just ask the right questions, push you in the right direction, do a little bit of advisement, and help you move along with your project. And if there's areas of the project where you'd like us to help you jumpstart in that area and then ramp you on to up level the capabilities of your team, then that's pretty much our engagement model. And we love doing it because every step of the way, we're 100% aligned with the vision that our clients have for their team. Whereas we understand so many contractors and consultants are always trying to posture for the company to outsource to them, when really that competes with the insourcing of developers. So we're kind of the anti-outsource. So we want you to be able to do more in-house with the existing in-house software team. So if we can help, just you can send me an email, give me a call, or go on our website, fill out the form that way, and let's visit and see if we can be of any assistance. Other than that, keep watch out for the next podcast, next video, the next webinar announcement, and have a great Thursday.